Well, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about the journey that Ontario Power Generation has gone through with respect to our musculoskeletal injury prevention initiative. Lisa Beach-Hawley joined us. She is an ergonomist. She did such a good job that we've given her a promotion. And now I'm trying to lobotomize the ergonomics piece out of her and use her in a more broad way. And Leanne Lee's actually started with us in the health and safety function, and I think she preferred to go and control people as opposed to support, and took a supervisory job at the Pickering plant. Very quickly, I'll give you an introduction about OPG, where we were with musculoskeletal injuries, our MSD prevention strategy, where we are now, key lessons learned, and questions, obviously. Quickly, I won't belabor this. Ontario Power Generation is not Ontario Hydro. We were created when Ontario Hydro was split up. We are the generating part of that. We produce about 50% of the electricity in Ontario that's used through 65 hydro plants, 3 thermal plants, and 2 nuclear power stations. We have about 9,800 employees across the company, going through a lot of downsizing and transformation with a headcount reduction of about 20% over the next few years. So we're going through a lot of change across the province as we move to be a reliable, safe, and clean producer of electricity. So the journey, really, we've been on a journey around musculoskeletal injury reduction for many, many years, way back into the early 90s. We hired an enormous number of ergonomists into the company. We did a lot of targeted studies, very, very good studies across the company, and at that time it was Ontario Hydro. Lots of work with power line maintainers and the work that they did, and trying to understand how to reduce the injury rate. But frustrating, I guess, in the sense that, like the statistics in Ontario and Canada and other jurisdictions, really the MSD injury rate remained at about 50% of our overall injuries. And so that caused us to kind of stand back and really question it. As a company, we have a very, very strong safety culture, very, very strong safety programs and processes. I think one of the key features for us is a very, very strong safety reporting culture where, part of it is that we identify hazards very, very quickly and put them into corrective action processes. We have a number of ergonomists in the company, good standards and tools, lots of training, instilled as a corporate priority, and strong models for hazard identification. But again, this persistence of these injuries at 50% was frustrating. The graphic there is kind of our safety basics logo that we use for almost everything. It's identify the hazard, focus on elimination, control, protect, and minimize the severity of something happen. So, culturally as a company, we had all these things in place, but we couldn't seem to tackle this problem. So, in and around 2008, maybe in that age, we sort of had this epiphany as we looked at what was happening with MSD injuries, and it was really, we weren't treating them the same as we treat everything else. It was that, MSD injuries were about the worker. They were worker injuries. There was a problem with the worker, and that's why they were getting hurt. We had this cultural bias, I guess if you will, in the company. And reporting MSD symptoms was seen as weakness in our plants. It's a very macho kind of environment, and so that was a problem. We have this system in our nuclear plants in particular where you can report anything into this, what we call a station condition record, and that could range from a nuclear power unit wobble or disruption to, my favorite was the mold in the ketchup bottle in the cafeteria. But we have this reporting culture, and the graph at the bottom really talks to our safety experience, the yellow being reactive or injury reports that we see in there, and the blue being sort of proactive, there's no injury, it's a hazard, it's a condition to fix. And you can see as we look across different sort of hazard categories, chemical, electrical, falling objects, the ratio of kind of the amount of proactive reporting and identification of hazards that we have On the MSD side, quite the opposite, where it was very much reactive. It was about injuries, it was about individuals. It really wasn't focused on the hazard or the condition that needed to be fixed. So I'll get Lisa to talk a little bit about the details of the journey.
Okay, thank you. So it was around 2007 when I started at OPG that Greg was spearheading a new MSD prevention strategy. And in fact, Greg was in nuclear, and it was actually a corporate-wide strategy that was started up. One of the key things, and this has been mentioned by other people, was senior leadership support, senior leadership recognizing that this was a priority, that safety performance, safety in general, is huge at OPG. I mean, obviously we want people to think about safety when they're working in a nuclear station, not just for their own personal injury reasons, but because for the community and the equipment, we need to be always concerned about safety. So it's a huge part of our culture. And it's one of our key business performance measures. So in order to continually improve on our safety performance, it was recognized that MSD really needed to be targeted. And despite what we had done prior to 2007, a proportion of MSD to our overall injury rate hadn't improved. And this was mentioned before too, that it's still broadly the largest category of industrial kind of injury. So we wanted to do something different. And the timing was good. Some of you may remember back around 2007, this MSD prevention guideline for Ontario was put together and really gave companies a structured framework to set up an MSD prevention program. Everything from having plans, having targets, doing training, having processes for risk identification and control, and there was a toolbox document that accompanied this that gave people tools to work with for hazard recognition. So it was a great time for us to start targeting this in a new way. So, sorry, our senior leadership was critical in supporting these endeavors. And why that's critical is that there's a lot of competing priorities in the business. There are a lot of things that supervisors and department heads needed to focus on in terms of, I'm okay, thank you, go. In terms of their business performance. So to divert people's attention to this and kind of give them permission to spend time and money on MSD prevention really required the higher levels of management to put their full support behind it. And also resourcing-wise, we didn't give particular budgets to departments, but we did put a lot of resourcing into our safety support to enable frontline departments to work on these initiatives, but have support from specialists. And thanks to the University of Waterloo, we had a very strong ergonomics co-op program. We really had great co-op students over the years that enabled us to provide quick and really effective, technically strong ergonomic support to frontline groups. And from the frontline group perspective, Leanne had a really good comment about the perception on the floor prior to this. Do you want to say a couple words about that?
Maybe. I don't know how interesting it was really, but I started in 2005, kind of precursor in nuclear to what Greg was doing, and we had the student go down to the shop floor, and at times it was a very union management situation where even though we weren't management coming down, it was perceived as such, and the student seemed to be a nice, soft barrier between that. It was like someone to talk to, empathize with, and get, in the end, seen as things to the benefit, right? So, by the way, we can get you these things, and there was no focus on labor management issues. It was what can be done. So it was a can do as opposed to can't do situation.
Yeah, and prior to that, Leanne had said that it was almost like the police coming when safety came down. People got on the defensive, the safety was pointing out, you're not wearing your hearing protection or you're not doing this. And the whole sort of MSD initiative to make their job easier and providing sort of non-threatening young students coming down to help them kind of changed the whole perception of how safety and front lines work together. And what we needed to do was shift our entire culture, the way people thought about MSD. And as Greg mentioned, previously there was sort of this macho attitude, you know, you're doing industrial work, you're supposed to have a few aches and pains and don't be a wimp and complain about it. But, you know, eventually people started really having difficulty continuing to do their job and continuing to do their home activities and go on vacations and things like that, play hockey and those kind of things. So it started to become more acceptable to speak up about MSD symptoms. And that's one of the things we tried to promote. I'll talk about it in one of our training initiatives. As Greg mentioned, the culture needed to change also around how we thought about MSD. Now, a lot of the presentations so far have talked about ergonomic change teams, and I think that's really critical in the initial stages, but we were kind of past that, where we really wanted to have MSD regarded as one of the other safety hazards that's treated equally at the same time in work planning, pre-job briefings, design of work. We have an engineering change process where all these different safety considerations, electrical safety, those kinds of things are all, chemical safety, all those things are considered, and we wanted MSD to be embedded in there. I think that's really important. We got, earlier, another group was talking about having a brand, having a logo on all of their MSD communications and so on. We did the same thing. We had a student come up with this little guy with force, repetition, and posture, talking about MSDs, and our little hand logo was following through on another theme, which was working towards 0 injuries. So he was on everything we did. So, in terms of processes and tools and interventions, it was very important to us to formalize annual MSD prevention plans, and we had action logs with assigned tasks and deadlines. As Greg mentioned, through our already established reporting system, we pushed targets for proactive hazard reporting. So as Greg mentioned, we had previously often seen reports after someone was reporting an injury or symptoms. What we wanted was for people to go out there and identify proactive opportunities to reduce MSD hazards. So we established targets and insisted that they be treated like everything else reported in our SCR system, that corrective actions be documented and followed through on. This has been also mentioned before, that what gets measured gets done. So specific targets were set each year for each department based on previous performance, so that there's a continuous improvement driven. And I mentioned how the ergonomics role changed from targeting groups who had poor performance to responding to their requests for support and enabling them to own their own improvements. In terms of some of the tools, we really created a huge library of things available to frontline groups to help them out. Our ergonomics website, this is what it looks like now. It's sort of evolved over the years, and not quite this sophisticated back then, but the point is to provide self-serve tools for departments to do assessments and find solutions and get education. Other people have mentioned having MSD hazard checklists. We had a handout tool for people experiencing symptoms that we put together with our wellness group. We worked with IT. This was important. In some big organizations like ours, you can't just buy anything you want and plug it into your computer. Everything has to be sort of approved and go through the architecture testing and so on. So we did work with IT and get a number of ergonomic devices approved, and we purchased RSI Guard stretch break software that was rolled out to certain high-risk intensive computer use groups. We created a whole database, and this is again where the co-op students came in handy. The purpose of the database is to identify risks associated with power tools in terms of weight, balance, squeezing the trigger force and so on, and rate them as green, orange, or red, and make a suggestion for replacing that older tool with a newer tool that reduced those particular risk factors when the time came to replace them. We did a whole assessment of material handling carts. Believe it or not, every rolling cart across nuclear had to be assessed. Our database has 347 records in it, so we went out with force gauges and took pictures and assessed tipping hazard and determined where the center of gravity was and so on, and rated all the carts, high, moderate, or low risk. And we have in this particular record noted a procedure that we have for critical material handling, we call it. So whenever there is a high risk, there's a whole other process to go through, planning out the path, making sure that there's a spotter or other things that will control the risk. One really good thing that we did was establish a database to capture successful ergonomic changes so that people can search for what other people have implemented that's worked for them. Now, this was across our whole company, the whole province, so it's different than a small company where in one safety meeting you can share a few successes. It was difficult to communicate successes across the whole company, so we created this database that allowed people to search for things related to certain types of work or certain body part hazards and so on. And these are some of the examples of the types of changes we made. And some of these things, you know, after the fact, it's kind of like the doorstop and the nursing home, you know, they're so simple. Why didn't we think of that before? So this was a very heavy example of a piece of equipment that had to be moved manually, and they ended up cutting holes in the base so that a forklift could be used to move it. This was a rolling step ladder to allow someone to reach something at a high level that they hadn't used before, and they were working over shoulder level in a really awkward posture with their electrical safety equipment on. Caulking, this was a battery-operated caulking gun that reduced a huge amount of hand force and repeatedly squeezing and static squeezing of a trigger on a caulking gun. And we have gates on some of our areas around the plant that need to be opened and closed, and they were done manually, but at one point required a huge amount of force and simple maintenance, really. The gates were balanced, a rubber stopper was put on so to reduce a pinch hazard. Very simple things, but really could make a big difference in injury risk. And they were all line-generated ideas. That's the key point. The other theme of the conference today had to do with training, and one of the key things we did was mandatory MSD awareness and prevention computer-based training for all staff. And this again was huge, only possible because of senior leadership support to allow people to take the time to do this across the whole company. When you think about over 10,000 employees at the time just in nuclear, that's a lot of hours of training, so it really was considered a priority. And we tried to really get to people by having testimonials in the video of a plant-based maintenance guy who had really struggled with injuries that had developed over the years, MSD injuries, and how that had affected his life, and a woman from the office environment with the same kind of thing. So you really need to hit people in the heart, I think. You need to think, wow, that could happen to me. It's sort of like when you have a neighbor having a heart attack and it makes you think, wow, that could happen to me. It sort of makes you re-examine you know, your own behavior and your own risk when somebody you know experiences something like that. So we were trying to achieve that through this video. And we did face-to-face training with high-risk groups. So we had the ergonomists and ergonomic students go out and meet with particular crews with the focus on helping them take ownership of their own work and get the thought process started of identifying and discussing ergonomic hazards and solutions. Okay, and Greg's going to talk about where we are now.
So, of course, my concern was, we do all this work, we have this big launch and this initiative, is it sustainable? Are we going to repeat the same pattern that we did in the 90s? And I can tell you that it has been sustainable thus far. In 2014, the MSD injury rate is about 24% of our total injuries, which is great news. And in fact, Lisa took these statistics out, but over the company, we've reduced the MSD injuries by 83%. Was that the corporate number? 83%? So very dramatic change. Really MSD, and if you went back, lots of people called it MSD, but they didn't actually know what that stood for, or WMSD, or there was a whole bunch of things. It is really part of our company vocabulary, which was a key thing that we struggled with, was just talking about it. And this proactive reporting of MSD hazards has significantly changed, which is good news. And the graph on the right just shows in 2010, sort of set an aggressive target of how many proactive reports we wanted to achieve, and the blue line is what we actually did. So, the fact that it's higher was good news for us. Key lessons learned for us, the leadership commitment and expectation. I mean, we have strong leadership commitment around safety, but it was really targeting the leadership messaging and the focus and the effort to challenge the way we thought about MSD injuries and to do something different. Most staff regarded MSD as a worker issue, and I'm pleased to say that we see a big change in that area, and it's not so focused on the worker and the worker's problem. It's about hazards and conditions in the field. The consistent language and talking about this. And really, for us, kind of a key piece of this was we always dealt with ergonomics and MSD things as different, as special, as a separate thing. We had special teams, and we had special people, and special tools and processes. And for us, it was really putting this into our existing safety management system and making it work very well, but work effectively. And workers and work groups needing to feel ownership of that, and it's been true for us in safety overall, but for the ergonomics piece, it's an ergonomics issue, or it's somebody's got an ache and a pain, call the ergonomist, or, call Lisa. Really giving them the tools and the techniques and the processes and the forms to be able to look at this themselves. And responsiveness, which has always been a challenge for us, given the distribution of the company, but when there is an issue, to make improvements and see change and get that momentum going. Publicizing things, really marketing what we were doing, showing success. I think a lot of people feel that, I'm not going to be able to make this change, even though I think it's a great idea. And being able to market that and publicize that and really help them see that they can, the people in the field can make these changes and make a difference. Obviously, what gets measured gets done, and communication, as always, critical. But for us, it was work the processes that we have that work so well for everything else, and put this stuff into there and make it work and live. So that was our journey. Leanne?
All right, so I'm here to add my insights. A couple things I wanted to add that haven't been covered yet are traps to the MSD, MSI prevention. Greg mentioned it's not an add-on service, and that's where we were in the past, where we've moved to looking at all your processes, procedures. You don't just have an MSD procedure, you might have an overriding one, but what part of that is in it? So in your training for a welder, for instance, you're going to cover all your industrial hygiene hazards. Are you covering off ergonomics hazards? Are you covering off, or is this, now you're a welder at our company and you have an ergonomic hazard? So just trying to get in right off the ground floor. More traps, sustainability, Greg talked about that. How can you create a sustainable process that goes beyond the very energetic individual you chose as champion? I'm assuming you should nod at that, because you said you were the one chosen. You're the energetic, the go-to cheerleader, right? So how do you get beyond that person and into the culture? Approach to change, is it enforced versus embraced? So am I going to Lion and saying, you now own this program? Or has Lion embraced the idea that this could save them some cash down the road? Lisa mentioned forms, people, resources, how easy are they used, and someone talked about simplify them, and I totally agree with that, because I just don't have time in my daily duties to go add on a whole bunch of extra stuff. So how do you get that high on the list? And training, what exactly you're trying to get out of it, right? So you go to your 2-day training and we talk, and we talk, and we talk, and we sit, and we daydream. I doodle a lot, but what is it we bring back out of the training? So I do we call them computer-based training, CBTs. I watch somebody, I feel compassionate for a couple days, and then what is it I got out of my couple $100 that the company put into this for me individually? So it took me 2 hours of time, $200 per person, per hour. What did I get out of it? So at the end of the day, are your solutions practical, or are they just there to prove a point? So personally, I like to see practical solutions that Line can own and that Line has input into. So that's where we've moved with this, and then I see whether or not Greg wants to hit on it or not, the psychosocial part coming in quite heavily, where we start linking not linking, but looking at sick time and other various forms of time off that we have, and how related to not just MSD, but all injury rates, and how closely related these things become. So I see that as our trend coming out in 2020-ish. Hopefully I'll be back.
I keep looking for the time sign, and nobody's flagging us with time. Okay. Okay, we're done. Thanks very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to share our journey, and we have had some successes, and hopefully if you have any questions you can ask later.